Alright, I think we're coming back together. We're going to play Hot, Not, or Sanctified. And how this works, if we say something is hot, we're saying it's positive theological inspiration. If we say not, we mean we don't particularly like it. If we say sanctified, that means only God's judgment can decide whether it's positive or not. We're going to do this with a few saints from history who have really fascinating stories. They've done some really, I'm not going to say outrageous, but they've done some pretty intense and brutal things. These are not the sort of people you would see depicted in an artwork where they're sitting around in sort of a dark room with their hands up in the air. Sort of, unfortunately, in the Protestant world, we don't have a very good imagination when it comes to Christian art. We always look at people like with their hands holding a Bible or something. Whereas you get to some of the saints of old and you see them out riding through battlefields. They have their symbolism of the faith on them, but they might be someone covered in arrows. You never know. Anthony's prepared a list of us of a few interesting saints, and we're going to play this. You can only say sanctified once, though. And those of you who are watching, you can send us your thoughts as well. So let's get into these saints.
I think, honestly, most of them we're going to find to be inspirational, or all of them, rather. But to go and get started, we'll start with Saint Moses the Black of the 4th century A.D. Saint Moses lived in Egypt and was a slave of Ethiopian descent until he committed murder as a young man. He was then banished and lived with a band of robbers. Eventually, he ruthlessly fought his way to be their leader. Once the authorities were after him, and Moses sought refuge with the monks of the desert, where he was touched by the grace of God and repented. It was after much begging and constant obedience that he was finally accepted as one of the brothers. Years later, 4 robbers attacked the monastery. St. Moses beat them senseless, but stopped short of killing them and brought them before the elder monks. The elders spared their lives. These robbers then also repented as Moses did and became monks themselves. In his life, Moses the Black was made a deacon, which he felt quite unworthy for. Later, he would be tested for the priesthood. The bishop over him tested St. Moses by reviling him as an unworthy Ethiopian before the altar. Moses accepted this abuse with the utmost humility, and after, the bishop revealed his intentions and ordained him as a priest. And in time, Moses the Black would have over 75 disciples. At the age of 75, Moses had become aware of a brigand attack that was to take place on his monastery. He blessed the other monks to leave. They begged him to escape with them, and it is said he responded, "For many years now I have awaited the time when the words of my master, the Lord Jesus Christ, should be fulfilled. All who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." 7 other monks stayed with Moses, and they fought the brigands, so that the others might escape until their deaths.
All right, he kind of reinterpreted that, live by the sword, die by the sword. He kind of was willing to die by the sword. He said, no, I'm going to protect some other people. Before we decide whether this is hot or not, Amanda, I think if we were going to do saints as superheroes, he's kind of a Batman-like character because you see, he'll beat people almost to death. But I draw the line at just going outright and killing him. Yeah. And he kind of has that transformation.
He's only mostly dead.
Yeah.
Which is partially alive.
Partially alive. Not the Michael Keaton Batman. This for sure. Anyways, Amanda, what do you think about this? Hot, not, or sanctified?
I don't know what to really, like, I've thought about it, and like Anthony said, kind of, they're saints, so the initial reaction is just to kind of do a blanket hot on all of them, but I think there's a lot of interesting things that are happening in his story. Personally, for me, when he talks about trying to figure out his priesthoodness, Thursday in a week, I go before our denomination's district board and explain why I think I should be ordained as an elder in the Church of Nazarene. So there's a part of me that's like this should not be a story we should all like take an example from, because the elder like just badgers him and expects him to take it. And I'm not the kind of person that if I'm going to be badgered by a credentials board, I hope maybe I can be as compassionate as maybe I need. Maybe what I'm saying in all this babbling is that Moses needs to be my patron saint for the next week. And I can take some inspiration from him.
He does eventually lead to 75 disciples.
Yes.
So things do turn out for him really well.
This is true, and because he was gracious in front of his credential board. So maybe that's the example I should take from that. But yes, then he interprets that passage very differently than I think a lot of people, even especially modern hearers, would interpret that passage. So there's a lot going on in the story that I think is very challenging if we actually look at it. It's not a simple story of how to be a good person. It really is to look at the world in which we live and try to be the best person that we can be by God's grace. So I'm tempted to call it Sanctified just simply because it's so compelling but also so difficult. And I think it's encountering some very difficult things, but I don't want to use Sanctified on my first one. So again, with more babbling, I think I'll go with Hot.
I'll say Hot. Amanda said a great deal on that, so I'll be the contender. Anthony, who do we got next?
We have Saint Anthony of Egypt of the 3rd and 4th century AD.
Who doesn't look anything like Anthony of Jolton.
He does not look anything like Anthony of Jolton, although I wish we had the picture of Anthony of Jolton dressed as Anthony of Egypt, because that would be so hilarious.
Look, he gave away his bluff. We could have had slipped one in there on people.
So, St. Anthony of Egypt, a 20-year-old who was very wealthy from his inheritance, but gave all he had to the poor after hearing from the gospel. Go, sell what you have, and give to the poor. Anthony then spent his life learning about the monastic life and living in solitude. In his mid-50s, St. Anthony opened a monastery of scattered cave cells for those who begged to be led in the monastic life. At 60, Anthony evangelized during a period of renewed Roman persecution and supported the believers, though he preferred isolation himself. In his late 80s, he had heard that the Arian heretics were spreading lies of his support for them, and considered the only solution to go to Alexandria himself and confront the heretics, where he renounced their heresy and surely helped overcome it for the sake of many of the faithful. St. Anthony lived to be about 105, but over the course of his life truly dedicated himself to God. He is said to have battled demons in the desert on numerous and perhaps perpetually recurring occasions, who came in all sorts of tempting forms. One witness attests to have seen an unrecognizable monk come and offer St. Anthony water during one of his fasts. But Anthony saw that the unknown monk was a demon, and the rejection and rebuke St. Anthony gave to the demon resulted in a great physical struggle that had left Anthony scarred, but the demon defeated.
You know, I'm thinking we actually need comic books of these. Somebody's probably made comic books of these saints. They would be awesome. All the ones that we're looking at today are going to be pretty awesome in comic book form.
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and say Hot to this one. St. Anthony's pretty interesting. One of the details Anthony of Jolton didn't add in there is he wanted to die a martyr, but he didn't. He actually lived to be 105. It's kind of interesting. Those never ask God for certain things. One should leave the revelation up to God. When I have found personal experience, there are things I said, I'm never going to be somebody who speaks regularly from behind a pulpit. And I was like a preaching at a church in my early 20s. Like everything that you say, tell God you won't do, or you're like, God, you're going to do this for me. It always goes in a different direction. Anthony thought he would die for the faith as a martyr and ends up living 105 years.
I love this story because, like, as an introvert, this is quite interesting. Like, Anthony's like, I want to be left alone, but I'll come out to protect the persecuted. And he's like, no, I'm going to go back to being alone. And he's like, I'm going to come out to tell that heretic what's what. And so he just lives this very interesting life. So even though he does not die a martyr, he lives a life of legend, which is actually quite remarkable. As we were talking about, I was trying to figure out our name for the episode. I think the last word in our title is martyrs. And then I was like, well, and someone mentioned, well, no, not all of them died. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. Because it almost seems impossible to be a saint without being martyred. Like, it just seems they go hand in hand. But here we have this fantastic example of someone who lived into his ripe old age and yet still through all that remained faithful to God. So, of course, Hot. And
again, for someone who's an introvert, like, look at the things he has to do. Like, this is like an introvert's nightmare. The poor man just wanted to be left alone in the middle of nowhere. And he has to go into, like, big councils, and he's got to fight demons, and people are always... The poor man just can't have any peace.
He's like an older version of Batman. He would be, if he's to be the comic book equivalent.
Yeah.
Our next saint is Saint Joan of Arc of the 15th century. Joan of Arc was born of a peasant couple southeast of Paris. Joan was 12 years old when she first saw visions of Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine of Alexandria, and St. Margaret of Antioch. Joan of Arc is most famous for her exploits in the 100 Years' War. After many tests and direct interactions with King Charles VII, she was finally allowed to fight. The king offered her a sword, but she requested she yield an ancient sword that was revealed to her. It was exactly where she said it would be, buried behind the altar in the chapel of Saint Catherine de Faubourg. Saint Joan of Arc fought gallantly in many battles, has had arrows through the chest, thigh, and even once in the neck. It is said that she was once hit in the helmet with a cannonball while climbing a ladder, shook it off, and stormed ahead. It has also been said that Joan of Arc actually did not wear men's clothing, besides perhaps armor, and fought while wearing a dress. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake at 19 in 1431 as a heretic. A second church trial 25 years later nullified the first, and in 1920 Joan of Arc was canonized by Pope Benedict XV.
Pretty hot. I'm gonna say this. This is the thing. We don't have an imagination in the Protestant world like we should. Like when you go to just about any church, you look at art, and even on our own district, and even things that I put together personally. You go and you look at some of the stuff that we do in the Protestant world, and you'll see people put together stuff, and they'll show what does the church look like, and they'll show like people sitting in pews holding their hands in there, maybe they're standing in a room, some sort of people kind of being passive in worship. But where you look at some of the stuff here, I mean, you got Joan of Arc with like this sacred sword, like being revealed to her from Saint Catherine, and it's in Saint Catherine's chapel there. She goes out and she gets that, and she's in battle, shaking off cannon shots to the head. Like, this is some intense stuff here. I mean, like, why when we send people to university, we need to make them like watch stuff like this, just read the life of the saints, and go out and be inspired to live like at least one of them. Like, pretty cool. Yeah. I like it.
And I do too, and I think definitely hot. And I think an interesting aspect of this story is that she is burned at the stake by the Catholic Church, but though kind of not really, because it is during the 100 Years' War. So she's really killed by the English Church, and then that's why later the Church, kind of Catholic Church everywhere, says no, the English Church messed up. And then later she is canonized as a saint, and I think it's important that we are called to be faithful, even if sometimes in the midst of organizations or structures that should be on our side. So there's some great lessons to be learned from her. And yes, obviously, if you can take a cannonball to the head and shake it off, you should definitely be someone to
I hear
emulate.
A meme coming to Instagram when you take a cannonball to the head and still live to fight on. Yeah. All right, who do we got next, Anthony?
Our next saint is out of Quiteria of the 5th century A.D. Saint Quiteria's life begins with the amazing circumstances of her birth. She was the first daughter to emerge from the womb of her mother, who gave birth to 8 other daughters in her first pregnancy, which means they were non-uplet daughters. That's the 9 version of twins. The mother was the wife of a pagan and elite Roman governor who looked contemptuously upon whom she bore. Comparing the 9 baby girls to a litter, she concluded others would compare her to a base animal or lowly peasant. Too proud for such a comparison, she ordered that the maid take all the babies and drown them. This bizarre birth was to be kept secret from her husband. The maid, however, looked favorably upon the girls and resolved to raise them with the help of the neighboring peasant women. All 9 girls were kept together, or in close community, well aware they were sisters, and were raised in the faith. When they matured, the sisters had apparently refused to honor a Roman god as Christians, and were hauled before the governor, their father, who immediately recognized them through familial likeness. Having discovered what his wife had done, the father resolved to take the daughters into his home and marry them to well-bred Roman military men. However, the daughters refused to consent to marriages to pagan worshippers. With that, the father had them imprisoned and locked in a tower. However, the resourceful sisters managed to escape, and in doing so, liberated the prison. They themselves, alongside the other escapees, fled to the mountains. The newly found gang waged a guerrilla war against the Roman Empire. In the end, the campaign was unsuccessful. Saint Quiteria was captured and beheaded, a virgin and a martyr.
This is an awesome story. And I don't know who this maid was and the people that helped raise these 9 girls. They raised them right because they had a pretty rock solid faith. And they resisted a lot of it's kind of like a fairy tale gone wrong. They had everything offered to them, but they chose to live for the faith rather than to give in to the pagan temptations. And it's not just any pagan temptation. It's pagan temptation to go back and be with your own family. It's just really interesting dynamics there. I'm not saying hot to this.
Oh, yeah. And that's like, I mean, to think in that society, to be offered to be, moved from being a maid, the daughters are really kind of these children without parents who are raised by a maid, and then saying now you can claim the governor as your father and then be married to men in power. Really, it's this promise for security, for long life, for comfort, and they're like, nah, we good. We're gonna live in the woods and fight the Roman Empire. Like that, like you said. So I mean, it's fantastic what they gave up, and then also again we have this interesting story of people of the faith fighting. And I can't articulate exactly how I feel about that, either yay or nay, but it's part of our history. And but I do think this faithfulness of these 9 sisters is definitely a hot inspiration.
I will say this: these people, they're not initiating violence.
No,
they're people who are trying to respond to it in the best way they can in a really, really brutal and savage world. And I am so impressed by the fact that, again, I hate to go back to this point, but they had such temptation. I mean, their lives going from being these childless kind of kids, which, I mean, not childless, parentless kids, going to have the governor be your father. I mean, everything. It's like the fairy tale, happily ever after if you'll just do this. But they're like, nope, we're not going to get into the paganism. No happily ever after for us because we have our eyes set on something beyond this world. So that's really cool.
I will say, forgive me for not saying this more forwardly, I guess, but all the saints today are going to have some sort of very harsh treatment or very, very terrible, violent situations that they had to face. So that's sort of a theme.
I think you're kind of late on that one.
I know, yeah, terrible.
Well, who's the last one we have?
The last one we have is Saint Sebastian of the 3rd century A.D. Son of a wealthy Roman family, educated in Milan, officer of the Imperial Roman Army, and captain of the guard, Saint Sebastian was a favorite personal guard of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. During Diocletian's persecution of the Christians, Sebastian visited the Christians in prison, bringing supplies and comfort. Saint Sebastian is reported to have healed the wife of a Christian soldier by making the sign of a cross over her. He converted soldiers and a governor to Christianity. Saint Sebastian was something of an independent clandestine agent for the kingdom of God. Charged as a Christian, Sebastian was tied to a tree and used as target practice for training archers and left for dead. He survived, and with the help of Saint Irene, recovered and returned to preach to Diocletian. The emperor had him beaten to death.
Yeah, St. Sebastian's pretty awesome. He actually has to spend several years recovering from that time he was executed. Again, he was ordered executed once. They thought they killed him. They turned out that they didn't. Turns out it's pretty hard to kill Sebastian, evidently, though they did successfully execute him the second time around. It's one of the Praetorian Guard, just a really, really cool guy. Again, you're not going to see any pictures of Sebastian sitting around sort of passively with his little hands, having a good time. No, Sebastian's out there, got arrows piercing all over his body. And he's a really effective minister, too. One of the things that wasn't mentioned in Anthony's recap, which is a great recap, is when Christians would be executed, Sebastian would a lot of times go to the families of the one who was martyred, because a lot of times they weren't Christians, and he would get with them and be like, look, you can have eternal life if you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. And he would work with them and tell them, look, your loved one died, but you can be with them again should you accept Jesus. And he works with people and brings them together because he wants, even though families can't be helped so much in this life after such a tragedy, he knows that God can still help them beyond the parameters of this life. And Sebastian, I just feel like his ministry, he really had he wasn't in it for himself, for sure. I say hot.
And like so many in the story, like Anthony was saying, we kind of have all these saints who have encountered such troublesome situations, again, like all of them, they face these great temptations where it could be very easy for them to say, no, I'm good. I mean, he was a Roman guard, one of the favorites of Diocletian, so it had been very easy for him to just forget his faith, keep on going, and he could have lived a very comfortable and probably prosperous life. And then again, he had kind of a second temptation after he survived the first attempt on his life. He could have just kind of went into hiding and again been like, okay, I'll stay a Christian, but I'm going to stay away from the danger. And instead, he encounters Diocletian and like confronts him. And I don't mean like encounters him like, oh, hey, you know, saw him across the way accidentally. Like he seeks Diocletian out and confronts him face to face with the faith. And so, yeah, this whole, I think all these stories are basically of people who had the chance to turn away, had the opportunity to just kind of give up, and maybe have been okay people, or even maybe good people. Instead, we see that they are truly righteous because they're willing to remain faithful to a God who is faithful to them. So, of course, hot, yeah.
I think it was a pretty hot list. I liked it.
Very good, Anthony. Yeah, and Anthony compiled many of the lists we do. He just finds and then reads, but this one he actually compiled and wrote, so this has been a very excellent Hot Not or Sanctified.
It has been a very hot list. With that, we thank you for joining us today. Again, send us your thoughts, questions, or comments. You can find me on Twitter at @JDylanProctor. Check out our Instagram page, and also we're on Tumblr, tumblr.com/Kingdom of the Logos. We're trying to have more prominent content out there to give you some inspirational things throughout the week that aren't just shallow inspiration, but really get your mind thinking. Be people of critical thinking in the adventure of life, and again, the adventure that is the holiness walk. And again, check us out on Facebook, YouTube, hit subscribe, like our stuff, follow. Please, it helps us out so much. You can download a free podcast on CastBox, SoundCloud, iTunes, and other places as well. And with that, God love you. Have a blessed day.